Hello students. So what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to kind of go over a poem with you, and this was one of the poems on the list of options that I gave you that you could utilize to start some test prep. And this is a poem by Emily Dickinson, and it is called Because I Could Not Stop for Death, and you can see it says 479. So a little background on Emily Dickinson. She wrote, I believe, like over 1,000 poems, and she did not title any of her poems. So what they do is they take the first line of the poem and they make it as a title. That's what they do in like books and anthologies and things like that. So that's why this poem is the title is the same exact line as the first line of the piece. And then 479 is referencing the poem number. So her 479th poem. Alright, so this was, like I said, one of the samples. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of just go through it with you a little bit and talk to you about the piece and kind of my own thought process in terms of how I would break this down if I saw this poem on paper 1 for your IB exam. So I'm going to read through the poem first, and then I'll go back and start talking about some of the things. And hopefully you'll notice some of these things as I'm going through it. I urge you to either print a copy of this before you go through it with me, or have it pulled up somewhere. I don't know what you could do, or have a notepad out so you could take some notes while you're listening to me. I think that would be really beneficial for you, just so you can kind of go through it and kind of jot down some ideas for how you might break down a poem on your own as well. So, because I could not stop for death, and then it has a dash. So I'm going to read through it and then we'll go back. So, because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too, for his civility. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of grazing grain. We passed the setting sun. Or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer my gown, my tiplet, only tulle. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. Okay, so this poem, if you haven't noticed yet, I think one of the biggest things that really sticks out to me is all of the dashes. And Emily Dickinson is known for using dashes in her works. She uses them quite heavily throughout many of her pieces. And so structurally, I would say that her dashes serve as pauses and punctuation and the ability to even emphasize certain words or ideas. And just in the first stanza, it's interesting because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. Essentially, those two lines feel like a full sentence. And then the second two lines, the carriage held but just ourselves and immortality, feels like a second sentence. So the dash in line 1 to me serves as essentially a comma, and then the dash in line 2 feels like a period. And then the dash in line 3, again, I don't know that it necessarily serves as a comma because it wouldn't be necessary there, but it just serves as to emphasize the pause and possibly emphasize the word ourselves. So in this instance, just in stanza 1, I see the dash functioning in 3 different ways. So one of my points might be that Emily Dickinson utilized the dash or the structure and the punctuation to really pull in the reader and emphasize certain pauses, certain stopping points, as well as emphasizing certain words. And then I might break down a stanza or two to really show how the dash serves multiple functions. The other thing that I would most likely talk about is I would likely talk about her ability to personify death. And so you know what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to pull up a way to make some notes on here, just so that I can type out some notes for you as you're kind of watching the video. So let me pull up some notes, and then we'll take notes while we're talking. So I'm going to type here, I would focus, one of the things I would focus on, the use of dashes throughout the poem, and then I might even say, you know, functioning as commas, periods, as well as pauses or emphasis on certain words. Wow, I'm sorry guys. Or lines. So that might be one thing that I would focus on, is the actual punctuation. So focus on punctuation and structure. So that could be potentially one of my points. And another thing that I might want to focus on is potentially, I'm going to make this a little bit smaller just so that it doesn't change the text itself. So, or the lines. So the next thing I might talk about is the use of personification. So obviously personification is when you take something that is not technically living, and then you give it qualities that make it obvious that you're trying to make it a being or a person, or, you know, make it seem like it's alive. And so there's a bit of irony in making death a living object, because obviously death is supposed to be the opposite of. So giving death life, you know, in itself is ironic. So you have the irony of that. So I could say the irony of death being personified or being made to seem as though it is alive, right? So there's irony in that, and I could talk about that irony. That could be another point that I might make. And then obviously the simple personification of death. So death is personified all throughout the poem. So this is another poetic device that the author utilizes, that Dickinson utilizes throughout the poem. It's really personified death. And then you can go through and look at just the actual the pronouns. So the use of pronouns itself showcases that she has personified death. So, because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. He, right, makes death male. So, I might say death is male in this instance. And then the carriage held but ourselves, just ourselves. And that's another word, that another pronoun that gives death the living kind of feel. So we slowly drove. He knew, again, we have all of these here. He knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too, for his civility. So you could go on to really talk about the journey that the speaker is taking with death. And of course, we want to also keep our speaker separate from our author, right? So our speaker, this is first person point of view, and it seems that it's a person who is dying, but it's not a negative. And so you could then hit on the tone of the piece. There really isn't any negativity or necessarily fear in the speaker's voice or their tone, so it almost seems as though the speaker seems calm and at peace with the actual dying. It seems as though that's what's happening in the poem. So you also have some other devices that the author is utilizing in terms of sound devices. So you can definitely tell here we have alliteration, right? We have some alliteration going on: grazing, grain, setting sun. We even have gossamer, gown, and then tippet and tool. And this is interesting here because they're both in these two stanzas. In stanza, and also you need to make sure you're noting which stanzas things are happening in. So this is stanza 1, 2. So in stanza 3 and stanza 4, the last two lines of each kind of emphasizes the use of alliteration. And as you're continuing, the poem has 4, 5, 6. It has 6 stanzas total, and you even have some alliteration here as well. So we paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the corinthes in the ground. It seems like perhaps that's the final resting place, the grave itself. And then since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day I first surmised the heads were toward eternity. So the ending of the poem really seems to say it's been so long, and yet it feels shorter than the day I died. So perhaps indicating that after death, time stops, or that death itself, the death itself is longer than, what comes after the afterlife. So, I mean, you might want to think about the overall meaning or idea conveyed. And that could be that, it could be a multiplicity of things, honestly. It could be that, the fear that we have regarding death is unwarranted. It's not necessary, simply because it's kind of natural and it happens. And the way that the speaker personifies death, it makes him, right, death, seem friendly in a way. And so it makes him seem, it makes him seem like it's not something, or he is not something to be feared. Death throughout doesn't do anything terrible. It's just death is carrying her on this final journey, it seems, to the grave or whatever it might be. And so the overall meaning could potentially mean that we don't really have to fear death. And thus, that would maybe bring me to my thesis statement for this particular poem. For this particular poem, I might argue that Emily Dickinson is exploring and personifying the idea of death in order to kind of make her peace with it, or even to convey to the audience that death isn't necessarily something that we have to succumb to. And she utilizes a variety of techniques in order to really convey that message. So that would be my thesis. And then throughout my paper itself, I would really go through and outline some of these devices that Dickinson uses. So one of my first things that I might talk about is the punctuation. The punctuation makes it seem like it's a journey. It makes it seem like you're just moving forward. And it also kind of makes the poem seem sort of sweet. When I see dashes, I don't feel any true harshness, right? Periods feel final. Periods feel, intense. But the dashes seem kind of ever-flowing. That's kind of how I personally look at dashes in poetry. And then I might talk about the speaker's tone. There is no real fear. The diction is very simple as well. The diction itself, I mean, even let's just talk about that stanza 5. This stanza itself, I would consider it to be, we paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the corinthes in the ground. This itself seems like the final resting place, and it's a heavy image. So this image in stanza 6, instead of saying, we came to the graveyard, I was about to be buried, the dirt or whatever, it seems very like the image itself is, house, the connotation of the word house is welcoming. Like if you say I'm going to, bring you to my home, my house or whatnot, it doesn't seem to be anything that you might fear. So it's interesting that, she might call this final resting place a home. So that image in itself and the connotation behind that word seems very welcoming. And you'll notice she even capitalized several of the words here. House, swelling, ground, roof, prince, ground. So all of these words are a little bit more emphasized, So that in itself, the tone in stanza 6 and the image that she uses and the diction that she uses really goes along with that idea that death isn't something to fear. It's just a final resting place. And when we get to death and we die, that's our home. That's where we're going to be. So that's kind of my overall take from it. I'm going to stop here just in terms of breaking down the piece. Hopefully you can kind of see exactly that, what I was talking about, and you can kind of make those connections along with me. If you have questions on how to write an outline or how to really decide which paragraphs and structure that, you can definitely reach out to me. And I can do more for you guys if you want more information or more breakdown on that kind of stuff as well. So, I'm just going to go through the poem. I'm going to read it. I'm going to kind of decide some of the more effective devices that the author utilized to really convey that overall concept that the poem is trying to convey. So I hope this was helpful. Again, you can always reach out to me if you have questions or need further guidance or assistance. All right, thank you guys.